everyone, and welcome to today's lecture by Dr. Michael Ignatieff of the Central European University. My name is Joseph Patridge. I'm a professor of history and the director of the sponsoring organization for today's talk, the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta, here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Founded in 1998, the Wirth Institute is a privately endowed, interdisciplinary, academic and cultural institute based in the Faculty of Arts. Our principal mandate is to help Canadians understand more about Central Europe, which we define as Austria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Given Dr. Ignatieff's tie to and experiences in Canada and Hungary, and I guess now Austria, we thought it was appropriate to invite him to give a presentation. But before I introduce Dr. Ignatieff, I'd like to introduce Steve Patton, professor of political science here at the University of Alberta and interim dean of the Faculty of Arts, to say a few words of welcome. Steve?
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta, I'm pleased to welcome Michael Ignatieff and everyone who is joining us as part of the virtual audience for this important lecture on illiberal democracy and threats to academic freedom. I want to begin by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory. Pausing at the beginning of public events to acknowledge this fact is a gesture of respect to the histories and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples whose presence enriches our vibrant scholarly community. Interestingly, considering the subject of today's lecture, when universities work to respect Indigenous communities and create space for Indigenous histories and ways of knowing, we find ourselves critically engaging key underpinnings of liberal democracy and searching for even richer notions of free, equitable, and democratic relations. Unfortunately, in these first decades of the 21st century, we are witnessing political movements and leaders whose political projects are challenging liberal democracy from perspectives that are distinctly less progressive. Various manifestations of authoritarian and nativist populism are taking hold and pushing back against liberal democratic values and commitments, including the principle of academic freedom that is so central to institutions of higher education. As rector and president of the Central European University, Michael Ignatieff has firsthand experience with the threat that illiberal populism poses to academic freedom. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Ignatieff here to speak with us today. I want to thank Joe Patridge and everyone at the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies for organizing this event. With a generous endowment from Alfred Wirth, the Wirth Institute supports research and scholarly exchanges that profile and advance research on Central Europe. Through its efforts, the Wirth Institute has contributed immensely to Central European studies at the University of Alberta. So again, on behalf of the Faculty of Arts, I thank the Wirth Institute for bringing us together, and I welcome everyone to this important and timely virtual lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. I do want to mention to everybody that today's presentation will be recorded. It's also going to be offered in the webinar format, meaning that the audience members, most of you, will not be visible. If you'd like to ask our presenter a question, please do so using the Q&A function, which you see below you on the screen. Dr. Ignatieff plans to speak for around half an hour, and then we will begin our discussion with questions from our panel of experts, followed by questions from the general audience. We expect that this discussion part of the program will last for about half an hour as well. Our panel consists of 4 specialists on Central European politics from here at the University of Alberta, including Laurie Thorlaksson, Professor of Political Science, Nicole Legosi-Schimpf, Assistant Professor of the Faculty of Native Studies, Christian Schimpf, Research Associate in the Department of Political Science, and Gergi Rajnai, the current Hungarian Doctoral Research Fellow at the Wirth Institute. And now to the main event. Our speaker today, Dr. Michael Ignatieff, has been rector and president of the Central European University since 2016. He's the fifth person to serve in this capacity since the university was founded in various Central European locations in 1991, in the immediate aftermath of the political changes that transformed Europe in that period. President Ignatieff was born in Canada, educated at the University of Toronto and Harvard University, and is a university administrator and professor, writer, and former politician. Trained as a historian, he has published widely on a variety of topics and is the recipient of 13 honorary degrees recognizing his contributions to scholarly and political life. He's also a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. From 2012 to 2015, President Ignatieff served as Centennial Chair at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York City. And from 2014 to 2016, he held the Edward R. Murrow Chair of Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The title of President Ignatieff's talk today is Illiberal Democracy and Threats to Academic Freedom in Europe. Dr. Ignatieff, on behalf of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies, welcome. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be back in Alberta, if only virtually. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. And thanks to the Wirth Institute and the University of Alberta for inviting me. I want to talk basically about what's happening to democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, focusing on Poland and Hungary, mostly on Hungary, and trying to answer the question why this matters to Canadians. I also want to think about what illiberal democracy is and what kind of challenge this version of democracy presents to democracy as we know it in Canada. And then I want to ask something about why is it the universities, in particular my university, have ended up on the firing line in illiberal democracies. Let me start back in 1989. When the wall came down, I think we very quickly fell into a set of expectations, a narrative about the transition in Central and Eastern Europe that didn't turn out as we had hoped. We thought we were going from closed to open societies. We were going from single-party police states with a command economy in the direction of democratic pluralism and market societies. And by 2004, when many of these societies got into the European Union and got into NATO, there was a sense that that transition was over and it had ended with the victory of, liberal, democratic, capitalist pluralism. And so there were people, Francis Fukuyama famously said history was over because that epical historical conflict between communism and capitalism had ended with a victory for you-know-who. And all of those myths and all of those stories have turned out to be absolutely not what happened. Much more interesting things have happened. I'm not going to tell you a pessimistic story. I'm just going to tell you that the story we expected to happen in 1989 didn't turn out that way. I think if we then begin to explain why it didn't turn out that way, I put some emphasis on what I would call the revolution of resentment in Central and Eastern Europe. Resentment of Western Europe, resentment of the EU. Once these societies were inside the European Union, something very unexpected happened. As Ivan Krastev and other people have said, instead of rejoicing in a unified Europe and being on a trajectory towards the standards of living equivalent in Western Europe, in fact, a lot of Eastern European societies, particularly Poland and Hungary, turned out to be resentful of the interference of the EU in their domestic affairs, the constant invidious comparisons between us smart, sophisticated Western Europeans and you poor, backward Eastern Europeans. And a dynamic of resentment emerged, which local political elites began to capitalize on. And the local political elites resented themselves their diminished margin of maneuver inside the European Union. And new political, the political elite that brought Poland and Hungary into the European Union. The transition elite, liberal, democratic, pluralist, pro-capitalist, was eventually displaced by a new elite, a very different elite that was small town, conservative, unilingual, didn't speak English, didn't speak German, didn't speak French, spoke their national languages. It was anti-cosmopolitan in their guts, and often very Christian in their religious adherence and beliefs, particularly in Poland. And political parties formed around this new counter elite. And Victor Orban, like many great and effective politicians, created his own electorate. He went to this small town conservative, unilingual Christian constituency and built a political formation around it, whose job was to defeat and permanently drive from power the liberal transition elite that had got Hungary into the European Union. I think another factor in this revolution of resentment was the financial crisis of 2008. This was a shock to the capitalist system as a whole, but it was a particular shock in Central and Eastern Europe because many Europeans, and this is true of my own family, I have a Hungarian family, my wife is Hungarian, members of my own family bought mortgages, they never had mortgages before, denominated in euros, but they were paid in non-euro currencies and suddenly found themselves underwater. And so the capitalist crisis, the global capitalist crisis penetrated deep into the family structure of hundreds of thousands of Hungarians and Poles and generated a very deep resentment of the multinational banks that had loaned these mortgage products to naive and inexperienced Eastern Europeans. And Orban came to power in part by capitalizing on this resentment of Western capitalist bankers, European Brussels bureaucrats, and so on. Once in power, the revolution that achieves power in 2010 then very quickly reveals a very radical face. That counter elite, that the anti-transition elite that took power behind Orban and then later Kaczynski in Poland, takes power in the name of all the forgotten people, all the people who got shafted by the capitalist banks, all those small town folks who felt ignored and condescended by the liberal big city elites. He speaks in their name and then begins to enact an extremely radical agenda. He believes that majority rule, having won an election, legitimizes an attack on the counter-majoritarian institutions that the liberal transition elite had put in place, namely a constitutional court, the media, the regulatory agencies, and, as it happens, independent institutions like universities. And so he uses a democratic mandate to attack the counter-majoritarian structure, which we call the liberal part of liberal democracy. So illiberal democracy, to the degree that it has a definition, and Orban uses this language from very early on, pits democratic majoritarianism against the counter-majoritarian limits on power that are built into the constitutional fabric of a liberal constitutional state. And he does so, he attacks liberal democracy in the name of democracy itself, in the name of we the people, the ethnically homogeneous Hungarian and also ethnically homogeneous Polish nations. Now this revolution gets becalmed by, I think, 2015 or so. Mr. Orban is in some trouble politically. It's not going so well. The regime is very corrupt, and so that's making him unpopular. And then he has, in a sense, a kind of gift from the gods, which is the migration crisis. Suddenly there are 1 million desperate people crossing from Turkey into Greece and then northward through the Balkans to his border. And suddenly there are 1 million people crossing the Hungarian border. And it's a traumatic shock to a country which is not a country of immigration, a country that is small, that feels suddenly overwhelmed. And when the German chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, says, come on in, we can do this, they flood through Hungary to get to Austria and Germany. But in the aftershocks, Orban sees that an immense electoral opportunity has been presented to him, which is to pose as a defender of Hungarian national identity against the Muslim hordes. I use his language, not language I approve of. And he casts himself as reprising a very ancient role in Hungarian history, which is Hungary is the Christian defender of Christian Europe against the Turks, against the Muslims. And he reprises this role, builds the wall, and then discovers in his disillusionment with Western Europe that Western Europe actually likes his wall just fine because it closes down immigration. And the Western European politicians can then criticize him for being such an illiberal autocrat, when in fact he's doing, as it were, their dirty work in immigration terms. And he then does something else because he's a very imaginative politician. He describes migration not simply as a demographic surge, but as a liberal cosmopolitan plot against the national identities of all the countries of Europe. And he then goes even further and describes migration not just as a liberal cosmopolitan plot, but a liberal cosmopolitan plot orchestrated by George Soros, multi-billionaire hedge fund owner born in Hungary, who happens to be the founder of the university that I have the honor to lead. When President Trump wins election in November 2016, that sends a crucial green light to Victor Orban. It's important to understand the geopolitical dimensions of this. As soon as Trump is elected, Orban understands that the US administration will not defend this little US institution, because we're a US institution, in Hungary. And that gives him the green light to mount the attack that he did on my university, Central European University, which was founded in 1991 as part of that liberal transition. And we trained, as it were, the liberal transition elite, and slowly the counter elite, the conservative counter elite, came after us. Victor Orban did something that's important, I think, to notice. He uses legalism. He uses legislation that looks like law, sounds like law, talks and walks like law, but it's actually just a piece of arbitrary political power play. A little piece of legislation called Lex CU to render us essentially illegal in Hungary. We then fight back. 80,000 citizens of Budapest take to the streets to defend us, and they go past my window chanting "Free universities in a free society," which is one of the most touching moments of my adult life. And I make this point simply to say that Orban is not hegemonic. There are lots of people who deeply disagree with what he's doing, and they took to the streets to defend us, and I'll never forget what they did on our behalf. But neither the US administration defended us, nor did the European Union defend us. And that's an important point. The EU, the myth of the EU is that it's a kind of transnational regulator of the democratic stability of its member states. That doesn't work very well. The EU has very little capacity to inflect or adjust the democratic systems inside member states. And Orban knows that. And so we had a lot of rhetorical support from the European Union, but no actual support. Orban expertly exploited the sovereigntist character of the EU to defend himself. He understood that the European Union is a union of 27 sovereign states. And when push comes to shove, they will not bear down on the domestic political choices of any member state, not even one that is kleptocratic, anti-democratic, anti-liberal. So long story short, my university found it impossible to continue in Budapest, and we have now moved to Vienna, and I'm speaking to you from Vienna tonight. Let me just conclude that end of the story. One of the ways to understand what's happened here is how steadily more radical the Orban regime has become over time. He has no incentive to tack to the center. He has started as a radical and become steadily more radical in his pursuit of power. In 2020, the European Court of Justice pronounced his legislation illegal. Lex CEU is illegal. But instead of backing down, the Hungarian government has made it even more difficult for foreign universities that they don't like to establish themselves in Hungary. On the other hand, they've invited universities they do like and have just in the last couple of weeks concluded a deal with Fudan University from China to come into Hungary to, as it were, to take our place. And so a free US accredited institution has been thrown out, and a Chinese institution that explicitly acknowledges the authority of the Communist Party of China has come in. And you can bet that in the political science classes of Fudan, and it's not a bad university, it's a very good one, but in the political science classes of Fudan University, you will not hear an unkind word said against the Orban regime. And that's what is happening in Europe in 2021. And what's more, the Hungarian people will pay the loan to build the Fudan University in perpetuity, $1.5 billion. In addition, finally, to round this story off, the Orban regime has essentially privatized all of its, or most of its remaining universities, turned them over to private foundations in which he's put his own cronies on the board of these foundations. And so a country with a great academic tradition, a great intellectual tradition, is seeing basically the subversion of the free institutions that used to be the glory of Hungarian academic life. And so in an astonishing way, a Fidesz party, which began as an anti-communist movement, has in its pursuit of absolute single party control reproduced the total cultural and educational control once achieved by the Communist Party that it was an insurgent against. So there's an ironic return to the past here that seems surprising and unexpected given what we thought would happen after 1989. Let me say a few things about the ideology of this regime. I'd like to emphasize the diabolization of liberalism. Liberals are rootless cosmopolitans. They have no national loyalties. They're seeking to impose their vision of multicultural pluralism on an unwilling and vulnerable nation. They are anti-Christian, they are anti-traditional, and they are anti-family. That's the charge sheet that a liberal in Central Europe now has to answer, both in Hungary, but also in Poland. And this relentless attack on liberalism as a set of values has made Victor Orban and Kaczynski heroes to the Italian, German, and Dutch far right, to those conservatives who are actually on the very edge of the constitutional system. And I think it's important to notice how importantly ideological he is, because this gives him an influence in European and global politics far above the size of a small country like Hungary. It's a kind of amazing conjuring feat to use ideology to leverage his influence in this way. And there's another feature of the ideology that I think is worth pointing out, and that's anti-Semitism. You couldn't walk through the streets of Budapest in 2017 and 2018 without seeing a poster that said, "Don't let George Soros have the last laugh," and a picture of laughing founder of my university, literally everywhere. And when it was pointed out that this is a reprise of anti-Semitic tropes from the 1930s, literally from the Völkische Beobachter, the chief organ of the Nazi party, where the trope was why are the Jews laughing at us? The Jews are laughing at us. We must take action against the Jews. When you would say to any member of Fidesz, look, this is an anti-Semitic trope from the Nazi period, they would say, don't you dare accuse me of being an anti-Semite. So this is something new. It's a reprise of anti-Semitic tropes from the 30s that denies that it's doing what it's doing. And so Orban claims in perfect sincerity that some of his best friends are Jews, that synagogues in Budapest are being rebuilt, quite true. But he does that, good friend of Netanyahu, and at the same time relentlessly employs tropes about the rootless, cosmopolitan, predatory character of the Jewish people that you had thought had been terminally disgraced in 1945. And so there's a resurfacing of and legitimization of this kind of anti-Semitism, not just in Hungary, not just in Poland, but in the far right of many borderline constitutional parties in the conservative movement in Europe. And that's a matter, I think, of concern to every one of us. Another feature of this ideology is that it conceives of politics as war. It's Leninist, it's Bolshevik in its basic attitude to democratic politics. And I don't think you can run a democratic politics worthy of the name when politics is modeled as war. Politics is not war. Politics is a competition for power between adversaries who respect their right to be in the arena. But that's not how Orban sees politics. He sees politics very much in the rhetoric and in the theorization of a Carl Schmitt, who is one of the most important theorists of totalitarian dictatorship in Germany in the 1930s, in which for Schmitt, the primary antithesis in politics is between friend and enemy. And notice the distinction between an enemy and an adversary. All politics is conflictual. I know a little bit about that. But the politics of a liberal democracy is a politics between adversaries, not a politics between enemies. And much as I disagree, for example, with Mr. Harper, he wasn't an enemy, he was an adversary. But this modeling of politics by both Kaczynski and Orban diabolizes the enemy. So you criticize the opposition in Hungary for being critical of his policies on COVID-19, and you don't just say, what you say in response to it is, you're anti-vaxxers. So there's if you construe politics to be the politics of enemies, there is nothing you cannot allow yourself to say. And so this combination of a diabolization of the liberals, the use of anti-Semitic tropes, and the conception of politics itself as a battle with enemies, I think does pose quite a present danger to democratic politics. This populist authoritarian conservatism treats politics as war and all opponents as enemies. It accepts no limits on the authority of its leader or its leadership, because you're in a death struggle with liberalism, and so everything is permitted the leader. And it's a threat to democracy for a reason we need to pay some attention, because it believes it cannot afford to lose. I mean, Orban is seriously concerned that if he loses, he'll go to jail. So he can't afford to lose. And therefore, he may not be willing to cede power. And so this raises the question of whether Orban would accept democratic defeat next year when he faces parliamentary elections. Let me work towards a conclusion. I notice I'm running the time a little bit, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. Why does any of this matter to Canadians? I mean, there is a story that says, Hungary and Poland are very far away. It's someone else's problem. We've got problems at home. I understand that. There are some people who say, the thing about Central and Eastern Europe is they never really had any democratic tradition, so let's not be surprised that they've slid back into authoritarianism. I think that's a mistake, because we forget, I think, how much the world owes to the Czechs who stood up to the tanks of Soviet tanks in '68, how much we all owe to the example of the Hungarians who stood up to the Russian tanks in '56, how much everybody owes to the solidarity movement in Poland that challenged communist authoritarianism in the 70s. Eastern Europe has given, in fact, the world an incredible lesson in democratic freedom, just as South Africa once gave us a lesson in democratic freedom. So I think the argument that, these people don't know what democracy is anyway, why should we care, is pretty wrong. No, I think on the contrary, Hungary and Poland are not far away. They're close. They're full of good democratic people, just like you and me. And I think that what we can't stop it. Canada has no leverage in Central and Eastern Europe. The European Union has no leverage in Central and Eastern Europe. The American government has very little leverage. No, the thing that will have to change is that the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Czechs, will have to decide, we can do better than this. We can have freedom. We can have responsible government. We can have government that doesn't steal from us. And I don't think Orban and Kaczynski are the last end of the story for Hungary and Poland. I don't think they're ushering an indefinite future of single party autocracy. We'll have to see what happens next year, but the future is still open. I do think the thing that these stories tell me is just how vulnerable democracy is. And I think every Canadian who loves democracy needs to think about just how vulnerable democracy truly is. Because here's a duly elected party that used a free election to gerrymander democracy itself, eliminate counter-majoritarian guardrails, and lay the basis for a single party rule, while the world watched and did nothing, and while millions of Hungarian and Polish citizens were unable to stop it. That's a disturbing story. It tells me, very simply, that democracy is fragile, and I think we've had a lot of experience of how fragile democracy is. Disillusion with democracy grows in every crisis, and we've all been through the COVID-19 crisis. And when that crisis hits us, we ask difficult questions about our democratic leadership. In Canada, we're asking questions about whether our political system itself is so fragmented, so subject to veto points, that we can't get a national approach to battle and beat this disease. I think COVID has thrown up serious questions about our capacity to act as a national community in face with the crisis. And some of our problem are our very institutions. And I say this with regret because nobody is a greater believer in the institutions we've got than me. But federalism, strong regions, and a relatively weak federal government keep us free when the times are good, but they don't serve us just as well when times are bad. And so one of the lessons that this teaches me is that there is a permanent conflict between the liberal sides of democracy and the majoritarian sides of democracy. The liberal sides are counter-majoritarian. The majority rule sides are by definition majoritarian. And the two are in a permanent conflict and tension in any democracy. And we see this very clearly when we see a guy like Orban trying to crush the counter-majoritarian side of democracy. Then we suddenly discovered if you crush the counter-majoritarian side of democracy, you're crushing democracy itself. And so democracy is in danger when counter-majoritarianism makes us appear weak in a crisis. And democracy is equally in danger when majorities become resentful or impatient about those counter-majoritarian protections, when they become impatient with courts, free media, and free institutions. And there's a line in certain kinds of Canadian conservatism that's very hostile to the independence of the judiciary, for example, and judge-made law. That's a conservative movement pushing back at the liberal side of democracy. And this resentment, the resentment of majorities towards counter-majoritarian institutions, can become lethally dangerous when the majority belongs to one race and the minorities belong to another race. When race cuts across this, then it can become explosively difficult. And I think we've seen recently in our democratic example to the south, the enormous strain that liberal democracy comes under when this conflict between majority rule and counter-majoritarian institutions is racialized. I just pray, and I think all Canadians pray, that our neighbor to the south can manage this successfully and strengthen liberal democracy, because if liberal democracy is weak in the United States, you can bet it will come under increasing threat in Canada. I guess my conclusion, and I really will stop now, is a democracy is either liberal or it's not really a democracy at all. And just in case I hadn't made this point clear, by liberal, I don't mean liberal, the capital L, liberal, the party I used to belong to, much as I support it and will always support it. I mean liberal in the sense of counter-majoritarian. We need government to protect us, and we need to protect ourselves from government. This is the balance that keeps us free. This is how we maintain our freedom. We have government to provide us with the institutional framework that guarantees our security, but we also have to have checks on government to keep it from becoming tyrannous. And when that balance collapses, as it nearly did in the United States, and as I think it risks doing in Hungary and Poland, it reminds us just how precious that balance is, that balance between authority and freedom, between majority rule and counter-majoritarian institutions. We need to keep that healthy, and our very lives and certainly our freedom may depend upon it. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, President Ignatieff. It's a wide-ranging discussion, and lots of different topics brought up. I'm happy to see that we've got a number of questions in the Q&A coming in. I want to remind everybody who's here with us that we're using the Q&A function for collecting questions for our speaker, but we also have a distinguished panel of experts who have volunteered to begin the discussion by asking questions of their own. So we'll start off with Professor Laurie Thorlaksson from the Department of Political Science. Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up, I guess, on some ideas about what next. And what do we do now? And to ask this question, not only in light of the performance of democracy in Hungary and Poland, but also looking at what's happening in the entire region, where we see in the last Freedom House Nations in Transit report that 18 out of 29 countries in the region have reported or experienced a decline in democracy over the past year. And so I want to ask about the European Union, where clearly it's been a great disappointment that we've not seen the EU being able to play an effective role to prevent this happening in Hungary. And you mentioned that Fidesz has become steadily more radical, and that made me wonder, is there a window of time or an opportunity that was simply missed? Like, was there a point in time where the EU would have had leverage? And so we've had two events occur recently in the EU. And so most recently, Fidesz left the European People's Party, the center-right grouping of respectable center-right parties, and arguably over the years it received a lot of cover from this group and a lot of legitimation. And then the second event in December, we had the compromise rule of law mechanism that was worked out to unblock the budgetary funds. The member states agreed to be able to link disbursement of EU money to respect for the rule of law, but with the proviso that there would be some a procedure that would allow a sufficient delay that there's no chance of this actually being applied to Hungary before its next election. And there's disagreement amongst regional experts as to whether this is an effective measure at all. So we have Ivan Krastev, who would argue that this actually was a workable compromise and necessary. Timothy Garton-Ash, who says this is a great betrayal. What sort of tools of leverage does this leave the European Union with, not only for Hungary, but maybe for other countries in the region that are backsliding? This is still a significant chunk of money that is under threat. Is it possible that this will shift the incentives of leaders that have authoritarian leanings? Is it possible that that party groups such as the European People's Party deciding that they want to distance themselves from authoritarian parties will affect the appeal, the public appeal that these authoritarian parties have? Or is it too late?
Great question. And I don't want to say it's too late. I'd make a general point, which is that democracy cannot be defended from outside. Democracy is national, it's local, it's what makes you cry, it's what you care about. Nobody's going to defend Canadian democracy but Canadians. No one's actually going to restore Hungarian democracy but Hungarians. No one's going to do it for Poland except Poland. I know some wonderful, I was just talking to some Poles recently, they're fantastic patriots, and they're going to have to get down in the street. I mean, that's where it comes down. Now, it doesn't mean that external influence isn't important. It's very important for the people inside to know they've got friends outside and people believe in what they're doing. But I'm very skeptical that there are any mechanisms, for example, the rule of law mechanism, that's going to provide effective enforcement and constraint on the Hungarian government. The Hungarian government has simply said, we're not going to take the money if it comes with strings. We'll just get the money from the Chinese or we'll get it from the Russians. So we need to understand how the entry of China and Russia into this area is very important, because it gives these authoritarians, some wiggle room. So I think that's a point. The one thing I would say in conclusion is that I think it's very, very important for conservative parties across Europe to draw a very clear line with Orban's conservatism, because I think this guy isn't a constitutional conservative. I think he will stop at nothing to hold on to power. And Merkel and all the conservative parties in Europe have been extremely slow to grasp this. They keep thinking, oh, he's a kind of naughty child in the conservative house. He's not. He's not fundamentally a constitutional conservative. I'm a liberal, it's not my family, but I would acknowledge that European conservatism has made an incredible historic contribution to building the Europe I love and respect. Some of the greatest Europeans are conservatives. They have different values than I, but they're constitutional all the way down for a very good reason, which is some of these conservatives lived through fascism, and they know that, if you don't have a constitutional democratic order, you've got nothing. And Orban is a different creature. This is a much more radical and dangerous kind of conservatism, and it would help if conservatives in Europe got up and said, from the EPP outwards, there is a line here that must not be crossed, and we will not have anything to do with that kind of extra constitutional conservatism. I mean, I know. So this is an argument about there's an argument about what conservatism is and how it needs to stand. And if I can make a slightly tendentious Canadian political point, and I have my difficulties with Mr. Harper. But Mr. Harper went to see Mr. Orban, and he went to see Mr. Orban on the assumption that there's this family of conservative politicians who are all basically the same. And that validates a kind of conservatism that has nothing to do with Mr. Harper's conservative. Whatever you think about Mr. Harper, he's a constitutional conservative. He's, and it's this confusion in conservatism, this flirting with this stuff. And you see it with Trump. People cozy up to Trump. Trump is not a constitutional conservative. He was 1 inch from subverting the Constitution of the United States. I mean, literally 1 inch. And I think conservatives need to wake up to this. Conservatism is a deeply contributing part of the political fabric of Canada, every country. I'm not making a partisan political point here. I'm trying to say there is a line, just as on the left there's a line. On the far left, there's a line. There are people who are willing to use violence for political ends, and no progressive person should have anything to do with such people. Ditto on the right. There are people who are not constitutional conservatives, and conservatives should have nothing to do with them. And that would make a difference if you had that kind of sense of the political frame. Orban would be much more isolated in Europe than he is. I'm sorry I got into ranting mode. Normal service is now resumed, but it's my way of thanking Laurie for an excellent question.
No, I think it's important to allow the discussion to continue and your ideas to follow. Let's see if Christian Schimpf's question will similarly spark some response.
Well, I would hope so. Well, thank you for the interesting presentation. I just want to pick up on your point that the key to sustaining a liberal democracy is obviously democratic support coming from the citizens, and sort of picking up on your presentation where it seems like that the story of Hungary is very much a story of expectations not met, and all the promises that we've made to the people in the early 90s that if only we stuck to liberal democracy, we'd be far better off now. In comes the economic crisis and the migration crisis, and here we are with radical politics. So I just want to get your, it's a very philosophical question, I suppose, but how willing do you think people are these days, not just in Eastern and Central Europe, but also in Western democracies, to defend democracy when their ends are not met, and you see it in different movements that take on a more radical view, where, you know, if we don't implement climate measures by tomorrow, we'll all fail, and it kind of makes politics become much more difficult. And we live in a world that's so fast-paced, but where we also notice how fast-paced it is because we got our smartphone with us 24 hours, and basically every minute there's a ping giving us the latest update from around the world. And perhaps there's a rising expectation among citizens that as fast as we get information on our smartphone, that's how we want democracy to work, but it's just not how liberal democracy is built, because as you said, when you talked about Canada, it's inherently incremental, and there's different institutions that, you know, that we have to go through. So I just want to get your sense of, you know, how do you perceive the general willingness to defend liberal democracy, given that people want everything now when liberal democracy is so slow? Thank you.
That's another great question, which is what you say when you're buying yourself a little time to figure out what the hell to say back. You know, it's a really difficult issue. It's a question about the ways in which expectations of democracy run so far ahead of democratic performance, and every politician who's been in the ring knows that, just feels it every day. You know, people are saying, why don't you fix this? And, you know, I was a constituency MP, and people were coming to me with expectations of what I could do as a federal member of parliament, which were radically disjunctive with what I could actually do, which is a little bit what you're saying. And then there's the digital effect that you're mentioning, which is we are getting news of how bad democracies perform every second in our cell phones. And then there's an additional feature which you didn't mention, which is that digital media are so disinhibiting. When I was in politics, I've told this story before, forgive me if I do it one more time. I must have shaken 30,000 hands in Canada. They didn't vote for me, but they were incredibly nice to me, right? But if I then looked at my media feed, it was a running sewer. It brings home something about democracy we don't notice, which is the democracy, when it's face-to-face, is ruled by a culture of civility, which is very properly inhibiting. It makes us polite to each other, even though we don't like each other very much. But the digital media are disinhibiting in a way that I think is radically destructive of civility in politics, and then creates this dynamic of insatiability, which is, what have you done for me lately? Why haven't you fixed this problem 5 minutes ago? And et cetera. And we've been living through this with COVID, where we have expectations of security, expectations of safety, which I'm not making alibis for politicians or their mistakes, and they made a dozen, right? But, you know, I'm positively relieved I wasn't in the chair, given the pressure of getting this right. And I think it's been damaging to democracies everywhere. You lock down, you let it go, you lock it down. And in this case, the horror of it is, if you're a politician, is people die. You know, this is where the mistakes really come home. And so this dialectic is very difficult to teach something about democracy, Christian, which I think is very important, which is a kind of a humble acknowledgement by citizens that politicians are human and make mistakes, and that we're all human, make mistakes. And if Christian was in the chair, I think you would get, I hope you would get it better than most of the guys in the chair, or the women in the chair, but you probably wouldn't. And this is a reckoning with democracy that we have to have with just basic human fallibility. Again, I don't want to excuse people who ignored the stats, who ignored good advice. I mean, there's some really culpable cases of malfeasance by politicians. But sometimes this expectation of security, this expectation of safety is properly corrosive of democratic faith itself. I just think we've had a harrowing experience with COVID of democratic fallibility. Give you one little example, however, of a counter story. My university is about to give its highest award to the Minister of Health of the southern state of Kerala in southern. She happens to be a communist, but Kerala has invested more in public health infrastructure over 40 years than any other state in India. What's the result? Lowest COVID death rate in the country. The only state where they're actually able to export oxygen to other countries. So what does that tell you? That tells you that when the crisis hits, you better have been prepared with 30, 40 years of just grinding out basic good government day in, day out. Because if you haven't, you can't catch up in a crisis. That's what I learned from the Kerala story. I don't want to romanticize it, but this woman who's the Minister of Health has done a hell of a job. But she's been able to depend upon traditions of good government that have stood the country, that province or that state, in good stead. And I think COVID makes us all look at this and think, there's some fixing we got to do here. We've got to have stockpiles. We've got to have national, protocols on a whole bunch of things. We've got to have some domestic production of vaccines. No politician thinks, we ought to have domestic capacity to produce vaccines. There's not a question a politician even asks themselves. And then suddenly it's the only question anybody wants an answer to. This is our democracy. And we live this together, furious at our leaders. And again, just to conclude, I'm not trying to give anybody an alibi. I'm just saying this is a very human problem.
It seems nowadays almost all discussions end up circling around COVID, right? And the COVID crisis, though it does fit into your pattern of crises, right? That keep coming up, the COVID crisis, the migration crisis, the financial crisis. How do these political institutions withstand crises, and how do the crises affect the outcomes? Well, let's turn to Professor Legoshi Schimpf for her question.
Thank you, and thank you very much for an excellent, very insightful talk. My question is more about consequences and policy consequences of this, calculated attack on academia and ideas, really. While these attacks on academia have been happening regarding higher learning, the post-secondary, I wonder if, what in your view are the long-term consequences of this, and if you think there's a trickle-down effect to kindergarten to grade 12 education, if there's an implication for school children and for high schoolers as well.
Another good question. I think it's very paradoxical what's happened, and the status of university expertise and scientific knowledge has been at the center of the democratic debate in a way that I've not seen in my lifetime. Every time Anthony Fauci stood beside President Trump, you saw it kind of played out. Here is a democratic, a populist authoritarian who understands one thing about science, which is that it's a challenge to his authority, right? You have this authority that comes from knowledge, and it's not an authority that, you know, Donald Trump can control, or Victor Orban can control, or Bolsonaro can control. So it produces this immediate dynamic of tension. These politicians with this style of populist leadership, who have this kind of friend-enemy dynamic, immediately understood that science was the enemy, because science would contradict them. Science would say, I don't care what's popular, Donald, you got to lock the country down, you know, and so there's this competing, two competing principles of legitimacy, as it were. Democratic legitimacy, I won the election, I'm the boss, versus the authority of science, which is, you know, validated by universities and peer review and all this kind of stuff. And in the end, this battle between two competing principles of legitimacy as to how decisions are made was fought out differently in every country. But by and large, after some painful mistakes, I think the authority of scientific, the legitimacy of scientific authority ends up being affirmed in this at horrendous cost, and not equally in every country. I mean, I wouldn't want to be a Brazilian scientist at the moment. It's just really tough. But, you know, in Britain, in the United States, in Canada, and I think this now gets to your question, it will trickle down to parents, and it will trickle down through our democratic debate. After all the loose talk about the fact that facts are fungible, facts are, you choose your facts, I choose my facts, nothing matters. You know, COVID has the property that people die. You know, so it's a ruthless test of what is true and what is false. And the statistics really show you that if you mask up and you know, don't do something stupid, you can reduce the incidence. And so we've had a tremendous education in the simple veracity of facts and the veracity of scientific evidence. And I think that ultimately will strengthen our democracy enormously. And I think it might trickle down through the parents to schools. I hope it will change our education. I am an aging gentleman who's scientifically illiterate to a shocking degree. And I would want down in primary and secondary school, kids start getting lessons in statistical inference very early. We get, you know, they get charts and graphs and begin to look at how facts are presented. So it's not just education in physics and biology and chemistry, it's also getting us all more literate about statistical inference. I know that sounds like a nerdy point, but I really would like to see our primary and secondary schools doing a better job at that, so that when those charts come up on the screen and when some politician makes some harebrained generalization on a scientific basis, the whole audience in the audience says, you don't know what you're talking about. That's what you want in a democracy. You want this kind of aggressive, comic, you know, testing of both the scientists and the politicians. So I'm hoping that you know, the populist authoritarians lost narrowly, you know, in the bottom of the ninth inning, you know, or the end of the third period, they lost, and that's a hugely important part. And that's where I come out cautiously optimistic about what COVID did to our democracy. I think it strengthened the respect we have to pay to facts, science, university learning. You know, and when you think, where did the COVID vaccine come from? I mean, among other things, it came out of universities. You know, I mean, you can't do without us, guys. I mean, that's what you have to say. We got to be less arrogant. We got to be less know-it-all. We got to be less condescending, et cetera, et cetera. We got to do a better job of telling our story to the public. We've got to get more people into post-secondary education. All that's true. But you can't do without universities. You just can't. That's what we have to proudly say. We have to be much prouder of universities as a result of this horrible experience.
Well, as a university professor in a province where the universities are being cut pretty dramatically in public funding, I couldn't agree with you more, I'm afraid. But let's turn to our last panelist before we move to the general questions from the audience. And this is our only panelist actually from Hungary himself, another political scientist. We have a lot of political scientists in the proverbial room right now, the virtual room. But Gergi, could I ask you to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much for your talk. My question would be how you found working with Hungarian universities both before the attacks and after the attacks. So were there any good academic collaborations before, and have there been ever since? And did you receive the support that you would have expected after the attacks were made on academic freedom in general and CEU in particular? Thank you.
We had good collaborations with Hungarian institutions before. You know, something like a third of our faculty is Hungarian. I mean, so the collaboration is effortless. We're an English language institution, but we had Hungarian accreditation and we had US accreditation, and so we did lots of stuff together with many institutions, and we had a particularly close relationship with the Academy of Sciences, which is the institution at the top of the pyramid. And very courageously, the head of the Academy of Sciences, the senior academic figure in the country, came out and supported CEU against the government and paid a horrendous price, because the government then went after the Academy of Science and basically shelled it. And they really don't care. And this particular president of the Academy of Sciences has just won the highest honor in the field of mathematical sciences. This is one of the best, most important mathematicians in the world. And part of my anger about this, and you know, CEU is fine, but I feel deep sorrow about what's happened to Hungarian academic life. This is the country that produced Teller, Szilard, John von Neumann, fantastic poets and artists. I mean, Hungary has been such a kind of source of cultural, intellectual, and scientific creativity. And this government is just banging it over the head, and it makes me angry. And it also makes me optimistic that eventually, people will just say, we've had enough. We've had enough of this. That's why I don't put stock on external factors producing Hungarian freedom. I really do trust eventually that Hungarians will just say this government is an insult to our country. It's an insult to us. We feel ashamed to have this as a government. This is a very partisan view of mine, and I know some people who are Fidesz supporters support the Orban regime. I don't want to be stupidly partisan, but I feel anger at what they've done to a great intellectual tradition in Europe. That's the core of my anger about this.
Well, I'd have to report that the Wirth Institute over the years has tried to work with a number of Hungarian universities, and generally speaking, the operations have been positive, if complicated. We probably have a shared colleague or somebody who you might already know, Adam Takacs, who was affiliated with the CEU, is now going to be coming next fall to be our Hungarian visiting professor here at the University of Alberta's Department of History and Classics. So we have an ongoing exchange. Every year we host at least one doctoral student from Hungary. I've been very impressed by the quality of the applications we get for our fellowship programs. Every year I go to Budapest and interview up to a dozen sometimes, or 10 fellows, people who are applying for our fellowships. And I would have to say at least the younger generation of scholars with which I come into contact are very promising, right? Independent of the larger political circumstances that we're discussing here. Speaking of larger political circumstances, though, I think now it's time to go to some of the questions from the broader audience. We still have some time to answer some of these, or at least to discuss them. And the first one that we've accumulated from all of these questions that are coming in is about a theme that you brought up earlier about anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism you mentioned is a typical anti-minority policy, says the question here. Do the other minorities in Hungary, large and small, occupy a similarly oppressed status?
The Roma clearly are have traditionally suffered horribly, and were also victims in the Holocaust. So there's a fraternal linkage and oppression between the Jewish people and the Roma. My university is proud of the fact that we've run Roma education programs for 20 years, and so we have real connections with the Roma community. But the government is not, I think it would be fair to say, is not explicitly racist towards Roma. And it's also, as I said to you, it's refurbishing synagogues in my wife's hometown, a small town on Lake Balaton. A synagogue that was closed throughout her entire childhood has been refurbished at the expense of the local Fidesz regime. So this is a complicated story. I would not accuse Mr. Orban of promoting anti-Roma policies. I'm saying that it's more complicated. He uses anti-Semitic tropes for his political attack on liberals and Soros. So it's a complicated story. He's also deeply hostile to refugee minorities. We have an education program for refugees at the university, and they have a very, very tough time. I mean, but there are refugees who've managed to get into Hungary, and they are subjected to minority discrimination. So it's a complicated. I would not call this a racist regime in that sense. I just think it's not, that doesn't capture. It's more complicated. In a way, they're too smart to do that. So that would be what I'd say about that. Second question. It's a common conception that pro-democracy movements in the Cold War era were driven by nationalism instead of a desire for democracy. So the backslide to ultranationalism and authoritarianism we see now is a logical development from it. How valid is such an explanation? What really is the difference then between authoritarianism and a liberal democracy? I think there's no doubt, and I wrote a book called Blood and Belonging about this more than 25 years ago, that when democracy came to Central and Eastern Europe after '89, it came in the form of nationalist mobilization. And in some cases, that nationalist upsurge was immensely positive. I mean, you can't understand the Polish thirst for freedom. It was never separated from, Polish patriotism, Polish nationalism, and strong Catholic feeling. And those things are I've always felt, positive emotions. Politics is driven by passions, and these were very strong passions. And the issue is not whether nationalism is good or bad or necessarily authoritarian. It's not necessarily anything. It's who gets control of it. Kaczynski has then grabbed hold of Polish nationalism, Polish patriotism, define it in a certain way. Orban has done the same. These things they grab the nationalist feelings and then channel it and capture it and define it. I mean, I'm happy to be contradicted about this, but I've never thought that Hungarian nationalism was rooted in Christianity, for example. But Orban has made a very close connection between Christianity and Hungarian nationalism in ways that are distinctive. I mean, there are other ways to think about why you love Hungary and think it's a fantastic place. I mean, there are all kinds of things you could say. I've said one of them, for example, that it has a fantastic cultural, musical, artistic, scientific tradition. That's not what Orban is doing. Orban is picking up, the Christian roots. So that would be my point, is that nationalism is a labile thing. It floats to and fro, and it depends how it's captured politically and how it's used politically. And it can go in a progressive democratic direction, and it can go in an authoritarian direction. It depends who wins the political battle over its meaning.
But it seems like people are interested in your connection with Christianity and Hungarian nationalism. The next question is about that exact issue. Can you further comment on the role of the Christian churches as enablers of the Orban and Kaczynski regimes, and on religion in general as possible drivers for democratic opposition? And then on the flip side, what role does Christianity play in binding these two types of conservatives?
Yeah. It's fascinating, this subject, because church attendance is rather low in Hungary. I don't mean to disparage Christian faith. I'm not a believer myself. I have the deepest respect for Christian belief, but you don't actually see. It's kind of not like Poland. The churches are not full. But the research that one of my colleagues at CEU has done indicates that when Orban was defeated in 2002, he basically created a civil society movement from the right. He took a page from the civil society movements that were progressive or to the left and created a civil society movement of the conservative right that anchored itself in the Christian churches, in the Protestant and the Catholic churches. And a lot of the Fidesz machine was built out of parishes. And the churches then have done very well under the Orban regime, Protestant and Catholic alike, and I think any other denomination. So again, I think it was opportunism on Orban's part, in the sense that he saw a part of civil society that was not claimed, that had been rather ignored by the transition elite. The liberal transition elite, Budapest-based, didn't really care about the churches in small towns and villages. Orban saw that there was a void there, and he went in there and grabbed them and mobilized, and so the rest is history. But again, I'd put a tremendous emphasis on the politics here. It could have gone a different way. I mean, I do speak to some veterans of the liberal transition in the 90s who are kicking themselves that they never sunk roots in the countryside, and as a consequence left a huge space for Orban to see. And there are analogies in lots of other places about this. The failure to pay attention to small towns, the failure to pay attention to rural life has been a besetting sin for liberal parties everywhere, including the party that I was once part of.
Well, coming at you from Alberta, I think an issue could be raised in connection with that as well. We'll go back in question 4 to a topic that you raised in your discussion, talking about how the EU didn't help protect the CEU or help support the CEU. It also goes back to Professor Thorlaxson, our Jean Monnet Chair of EU Studies at the University of Alberta, her discussion of the mechanisms of the EU. Do you think the EU can expel Hungary from the EU? Are there not mechanisms by which it could leverage Hungary and Poland into less repressive policies? I guess if they don't kick it out totally, at least leverage them a little bit?
I think expulsion is vanishingly unlikely, partly because they've lost Britain, and so they don't want more people dropping over the side. It would be very damaging to the project to go from 28 to 27 and then to 26. Secondly, the growing influence of China in that region poses geostrategic issues, and were Hungary to be expelled, it falls into the lap of China, and we also need to remember that Hungary is a member of NATO, so it has hugely destabilizing effects on the southern eastern frontiers of NATO. I don't think they'll be expelled, and that's part of the cynical game. Orban knows he can't be expelled, basically. And as I've said, I've had fantasies for years that, you know, Angie Merkel picks up the phone on a Friday night and says, Victor, I'm looking at this EU budget, and if I don't get some low-hanging fruit from you by Monday, I'm cutting, you know, a couple billion off it. Have a nice weekend. But that's not how the EU works. It is just not going to happen, you know, because it's a union of sovereign states, and I've learned that, you know, Copenhagen doesn't want to get a phone call like that any more than Budapest does. So they all line up against any pressure from the big states like France and Germany.
Well, in some ways, the parallel's been made, and you made this also earlier, I think, about the federal system of Canada and the parallels with the EU and the difficulty for the central authorities dealing with the individual units, whether they be provinces or states. The next question, which we're coming to the end of our time, I think, but we have time hopefully for one or two more. Thank you for your high-level view of what's been happening in Europe for the last 30 years. I'm struck by how similar the narrative you tell us is to what's developing in North America. In Alberta, as I was saying, the connections with Alberta, with politics as war and othering our political adversaries, such that a conversation across the political boundaries becomes difficult, if not impossible. How do we get back on track? Do you see any viable opposition evolving in Hungary? Do you have hope for the next election? So here you see we put together a few different questions, some more specific or contextual to Canada and some more to Hungary, but it's all yours.
Hope for the next elections in Hungary. I think there's considerable evidence that the various opposition parties will have primaries, and then they'll settle on one candidate. And I think when they settle on one candidate, for example, the current mayor of Budapest is a very honest, hardworking guy and kind of looks like a good candidate to me. What do I know? But he could beat Orban. I'm not completely pessimistic, but the Fidesz regime has a huge machine. It's dug into the countryside. It has gerrymandered the electoral system, so it's a very steep climb, but it is conceivable that Orban could lose in the elections next year. And as I say, I think that's the only prospect for change in the country is internally generated by Hungarians just saying they've had enough. To go back to the questions that are closer to Alberta and home, and I think we're all worried about this. I have no magic remedies at all. What I'm trying to say is that liberal politics, and by liberal I don't mean party political liberal, but liberal politics in general, depends on certain cultural habits of restraint, the modeling of your opponent as an adversary, not as an enemy, which means that an adversary today is an ally tomorrow, which means that, you know, he's a good Canadian, she's a good Canadian, et cetera. And Canada, you know, I don't want to put on a stuck record here, but Canada has shown real genius, political genius of enormous importance to the world in managing differences and antagonisms that have broken other countries apart. Our great challenge at the moment, and Steve acknowledged the Treaty 6 peoples at the beginning in a necessary and important gesture. Our great challenge at the moment is to be reconciled to and with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. But we got a lot of fixing to do and talking to do and listening to do, and it's, you know, but we have so far refused to other each other. We're trying to find a way to speak about the hurt and pain and damage that has been done in this relationship, and it's important that Canada understands how important this is to the world, because, you know, we're not doing a great job, but we're not doing a terrible job either. And it's this recognition that your opponent is an adversary, never, ever an enemy. And also on both sides, a mutual recognition, we're in this together. There's no escape. There's no other planet we can go to sort out the problems between Aboriginal Canadians and other Canadians. There just isn't. We're stuck with each other. And you can't call one group a settler who doesn't really belong here. You can't say somebody's more authentically here than anybody. We're here. We're here, period. It doesn't matter how long you've been here. We're here. We're a political community. This political community is closed in that sense. There's no exit. And we don't necessarily need to love each other or share each other's histories, but we just need to acknowledge each other at that basic level, that these are citizens talking to citizens, equal citizens talking to equal citizens, across enormous differences of race, gender, creed, history, all of it. But that's the nature of politics everywhere. You know, go to Spain, go to Greece, go to Hungary, go everywhere. And the menace to that kind of politics is authoritarian populists who think politics is war, who thinks politics is about ultimate victories. There are no ultimate victories in politics. There are only compromises in which we all come out of it with less than we would ideally want in some perfect world. And Canada's been pretty good at doing that. And everything we're talking about is divisive. I mean, there are all kinds of things where it actually helps to understand how divisive the things we take for granted are. Example, environment. The number of times people say, well, it's just perfectly evident that that we're doomed unless we all do X, Y, and Z on the environment. And anybody who doesn't understand that is somehow doesn't really belong to the community. Well, I'm sorry, but the environment is the most divisive issue in Canadian politics. And we've got to understand that our interests are radically opposed on these issues, but we're still citizens of the same piece of real estate. I mean, I say this with feeling in Alberta, because you can't run a federation if one half of the country is saying all those people in Alberta don't really care about the planet. I mean, there's something wrong with them. Oh, wait, come on, you know. And that's a tendentious example, perhaps, but I speak with some feeling about it, because there are no political commitments that cannot be legitimately questioned by someone else. That's the nature of politics. There are no religious questions in politics, and politics in the environment is not a religious question. It's a political question that has to be solved politically, right? That's, you know, and we other people with our self-righteousness. We other people when we say, well, I have a set of views about Aboriginal questions, or about environmental questions, or about, you know, the French fact in North America, which do not admit of discussion because they're just correct. Politics doesn't allow that. It just doesn't. And the moralism, and this is directed at liberals, the moralism of liberalism is dangerous to a political community, just as the moralism of conservatives. The moralism of conservatives on family values, on, you know, what is a family? Give me a break, you know?
Well, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention.
I'm trying to say we're stuck in a room without an exit, and we have to talk, because we could blow the whole thing up.
Well, I would just say that we at the Wirth Institute have, one of the panelists right now is from our Faculty of Native Studies, which is Canada's, as far as I know, only freestanding Faculty of Native Studies at any university. We've been working with Professor Lugosi Schimpf's help to organize discussions in Budapest between Roma scholars and Indigenous scholars to talk about the parallels of the situations or the differences between the situations of First Nations and other Indigenous peoples here and those people, the Roma people that you mentioned in your presentation. I'm afraid we're almost out of time. Can we have one more question? You up for a question in your capacity as a historian?
I'll try to be a little more concise. Forgive me, I feel I'm among friends, so I get a little carried away.
Okay. Well, you're a historian. It seems like many political scientists don't take history seriously. And this is not my question, even though I'm a historian too. Any historian would tell you a lot about the Central European region, Sondeweg. History matters, geography matters, nationalism matters. Why does it come as a surprise to so many observers? History.
Well, I'm about to tease our interim dean of arts. It's those damn political scientists who are to blame, you know. Look, you know, I think it helps us a lot as citizens to understand that we're not just creatures of our race, of our religion, of our class, of our education. We are also creatures and sometimes prisoners of our histories. And I've never forgotten going to Aboriginal communities when I was in politics and just encountering a different story, you know, just a different story. And these are sometimes, we come away with a tragic sense of how incommensurable these stories are. So I certainly felt as my brief and unsuccessful period in politics that history was the single most important discipline that I had to bring to reflection when you couldn't understand why Quebecers had a particular reaction to some issues unless you understood a long history in Canada. You just had to take it in and I mean, a lot of what's good about history when you do it right is that you take the helmet off your head. You know, you take the helmet off and you put someone else's helmet on, you put their goggles on, you suddenly begin to see time differently. I mean, everything we do is time dependent and time and path dependent. And we have to understand that. And no matter how fast this gets back to Christian's point, no matter how fast the future seems to accelerating, the only way we can understand what's coming at us is with a clear view of what's behind. So, I mean, that's said by a historian. I'm incorrigible. I'm loyal to my discipline. You'll forgive me, Steve.
Well, on that point, I mean, maybe just a personal anecdote related to the issue of history as a historian. I actually did my dissertation research in Austria, West Germany, and Czechoslovakia in 88, 89, 90, in that period. And I was asked to give the commencement address, or one of the commencement addresses, at the graduation in Berkeley in 91 at the Greek Theater. I stood up and I said, you know, everybody's talking about the end of history. I think this is actually the beginning, or history starts, right? There's going to be a lot of stuff coming at us now after the Cold War is over. And I think I was right. There's a lot of history out there, right? And I think at this point, I'll leave you for the final comment, final question, final wrap up. We're out of time, but any final words?
No, just to thank the Wirth Institute, thank the University of Alberta, thank all you lucky Edmontonians. Thank everybody who stood by and listened to this. Apologies if I ranted, apologies if I insulted anybody. I'm sure it was inadvertent, I promise you. It was just nice to be back with my fellow citizens. So thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Good night.
I'll say also goodbye to everyone. Thank you again, President Ignatieff, for agreeing to come to the discussion, come to the table here and talk. And for everybody else out there, we're apologizing. You see in the chat that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but please stay in touch and keep an eye out for future activities of the Wirth Institute. If you're interested in Central Europe, we're the place in Canada to go. And we'd be happy to talk with you more on these topics. Thank you very much and goodbye, everybody.